in this series, continuing in this series called All In. It's kind of themed after our entire year, where we're looking at this idea that people who are sold out to Jesus, people who are all in, are dedicated to living out their faith, and not only living it out, but sharing their faith with other people. And so we're looking at Hebrews chapter 11, this collection of people who are recorded as doing just that. They were all in, they were sold out to their relationship with God, and they were sold out to faith. And so we're going to study through all of Hebrews chapter 11 throughout this series. But I want to just share with you a story that was kind of shared in our small group. Back in 1952, there was a lady by the name of Frances Chadwick. Anybody know her? A couple of you do from small group. Frances Chadwick decided to swim 26 miles from California to the Catalina Islands. She made it 15 hours before she gave up. Sadly, she gave up just 1 mile from shore. I think what's so phenomenal about her story is it wasn't the freezing cold water. It wasn't the possibility of shark attack. It wasn't the enormous amount of jellyfish that were in the water that stopped her from making it to her goal. It was something as simple as some fog that set in. You see, the fog had settled in, and she could no longer see the shore. She didn't know quite where she was at, and she gave up. I wonder if that's not kind of true of our personal lives, that at times things are going great and we're going at it, but then like the fog sets in and we just kind of quit. I don't want to just leave you there. I want to just remind you that 2 months later, she made the exact same swim. And again, about a mile from shore, fog set in. This time she didn't quit. You see, she had developed a mental picture of the shoreline. And she just, as Dory would say, just kept swimming. But I think that that's very true of our personal lives and our spiritual lives, where maybe some of those big things like shark attacks and cold water and jellyfish and all those things that we can kind of see and project, we go, I can make it through those. But it's when this fog sets in, we just don't have a clear vision of where we're supposed to be or where God's leading, and we just quit. I got to tell you a little story. Back in 1978, my parents walked into Cherry Avenue Christian Church. They had never been to church there in their life, and they weren't going to church, but my parents walked into Cherry Avenue Christian Church and met a phenomenal guy by the name of Ralph Carter. And my parents had one simple question. They just asked Ralph if he would perform their wedding ceremony. And he said, absolutely, I'll do that. Now, I think what's so phenomenal about that is we find ourselves some places in some churches where we have all these restrictions on people, like you can't get married here, you can't do that, or I won't marry you unless you come to church 12 times, or whatever ridiculous it is. He just said, I'm going to share the love of Jesus with you, and if you would like to get married, I will perform the ceremony, right? You see, what he did in that very moment was he left the door open. Little did he know that somewhere around 1995, that's a long time. Somewhere around 1995, my dad walked back into that same church to find out what kind of Bible he needed to buy because their life was falling apart. And you know why he walked back into that church? Because a guy by the name of Ralph Carter showed love and grace and mercy and just left the door open for Jesus. The rest of the story goes that in November of 1996, my entire family gave our lives to Jesus. Now, I wish I could tell you that the rest of the story was smooth sailing and we just kept swimming and things were great and we were always swimming with the current, so we really didn't have to swim that hard and everything was perfect, but that's not kind of the way it played out. It was 1998 when a guy by the name of Dave Cuthbertson took me to lunch and said, "You've got all the gifts it takes to share the gospel. I just need to know if you'll give Jesus a chance." And I told him I'd give him 1 semester of Bible college. I went off to Bible college, and that same semester, I got my girlfriend pregnant. If you're visiting with us, yes, you're at that type of church. My girlfriend at the time got pregnant. We had 2 boys. One of them passed away 7 days after birth. I got kicked out of Bible college. The fog had set in. And it was thick. But we just kept swimming. Wasn't long after that the president of the Bible college called and said, "We'd love for you to come back and learn and study and do all those types of things because we know you got the gift and ability to do this." 7 years later, our youngest son was born on the anniversary of one of our oldest sons' death. Born 7 days and 7 years later on Easter Sunday. God is good. And he's got a plan even when the fog sets in. And I think that that's kind of what we see in this story this morning about fog, and do we ever just feel like giving up? Because that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. Flip over to Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 1. He says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so you will not grow weary and lose heart." He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, I think that I've mentioned before, anytime we see the word therefore, we ought to go back and see what it's. Therefore. Okay, 3 of you. Therefore. It's there to point us back to Hebrews chapter 11, where we see these great men and women of faith. And what the writer of Hebrews says is, listen, when the fog sets in, when everything seems dark and despair seems to set in, I want you to know that there's this great cloud of witnesses, all of these people listed in Hebrews chapter 11, who are cheering you and I on to keep going, to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because faith pleases God. And that's kind of the story we get in Hebrews chapter 11. And I'm going to start, and we're going to read verses 5 and 6 about a guy by the name of Enoch. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who what? He pleased God. Now, let's just stop right there, because that's an amazement all of its own, that Enoch was taken from this life because he didn't experience death. There's only one other person in all of Scripture that Scripture says that happens to. It's Elijah. And so what it says is that he was taken and didn't experience death. Why? Because he pleased God. So what is it about Enoch's life that was so pleasing to God? Let's look at verse 6. And without what? Faith, it is impossible to do what? Please God. So here we have this guy by the name of Enoch, who is commended to him because he pleased God. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. It's obvious that Enoch was an amazing man of faith, that he lived out faith. He had an amazing experience with God because of his amazing faith. Now, I don't want to miss this, so let's slide over to Genesis chapter 5. Let's slide over to Genesis chapter 5. We'll start in verse 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. We got any 65-year-olds in here ready to have another kid? Didn't think so. By faith, Enoch pleased God. Maybe God's asking you for that. I'm just kidding. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch did what? He walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch what? He walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because what? God took him away. If it's repeated, it's important. So what's repeated is that Enoch walked faithfully with God. For 300 years, Enoch walked faithfully with God. And if I look at my story, if you look at your story, I'm going to guess that there's no perfect stories in here. Life has its ups and downs, times of victory and times of defeat. But this entire book is about his story. It's about the story of God trying to bring redemption to man, that we would come back into a right relationship with God. Since Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve in the garden, and he says, did God really say? And Eve took some, gave some to Adam as well, her husband who was with him. Since that moment, God has been working his plan for you and I to be back into a right relationship with him. So much so, he sent his one and only son to die on our behalf. I'm sure that in Enoch's spiritual journey of 300 years, obviously there were some times when he was on the mountaintop and he could look out and he could see the amazing beauty and splendor and works of God, right? But I'm also guessing that in his 300 years, his spiritual journey, there were some times when he was in the valley and fog had set in and he really couldn't see which path God really wanted him to take. But he kept walking faithfully with God. Christian was showing me a video, was it yesterday? Christian was showing me a video yesterday of this guy who's flying in his small Cessna aircraft, right? And the plane decides that it no longer wants to work and he begins to crash. Not only does the plane begin to crash, but when it crashed, it landed right on a set of railroad tracks. Not only did it crash and did it land on a set of railroad tracks, but there's a train coming. I mean, I'm watching this video going, this is the most unluckiest guy on the entire planet. I mean, not only does his plane give up, he crashes, he lands on the railroad tracks, and it couldn't be like abandoned railroad tracks. It got to be like the superhighway of railroad. I think that's probably what's going through his mind. The video ends with people coming to his rescue and pulling him out to safety. And I thought, man, this guy's plane crashed. He landed on railroad tracks with an oncoming train. But the way that story ends, he probably could have been right there going, man, what gives? But in the end of the day, he's still alive and he's pulled to safety. All about perspective. Let me ask you this. As Enoch walked with God, let me ask you this. Who are you walking with? Who is it that you're on a journey with? You see, I think there's three things that happen when we walk with people. The first thing is when we walk with someone, we acknowledge the fact that they're what? They're walking with us. That they're alongside of us. We're not on our own. The second thing is when we're walking with someone, we can acknowledge the fact that we're walking in the same direction. You see, we can't walk together if one of us is going this way and one of us is going that way. And that's what God desires for us, is that we'd walk with him, we'd walk in the same direction with him. When we come alongside, when we come to places where we see people heading in the opposite direction, what God desires for his people is to faithfully follow and just put out a hand and go, hey, you should walk with me. I think lastly, when we walk with people, they oftentimes keep us going until we get to our destination. There are often times where we walk along a path or on a journey, and maybe fog sets in, maybe the hike gets tough, and we just feel like giving up, but God goes, just keep one more step. One more step. One more step. Finally, here in just a few moments, I'm going to close all this up, and you're all going to walk on. You're going to walk to a brand new place. You'll be out in the big old world walking. And sometimes your path is going to be clear and you'll know the exact direction you need to go. The other times there's going to be fog that sets in. As an experiment, while I was writing this sermon, I sat in the office and I was going back and forth about, so what? And Aaron came into the office and I just said, hey, this is all I said to him. Will you walk with me to the Gaga Ball pit? And I sat there. I want to read you his response. For what? I'm going to do this in my best impersonation too. For what? That's random. Now, I want you to know that I just asked, will you walk with me to the Gaga Ball pit? I didn't say another word. I sat there stone-faced, didn't open my mouth. Are you going to murder me? He then began to put his coat on. He looks at me and says, "I'm nervous." We walked outside, and we took a few steps before he paused and just stopped for a few moments before he continued to walk on. At one point, I looked up and he was kind of chuckling. And then when we got there, I could tell on his face he recognized that we had arrived at the destination in which we set out for. Now, that was all well and good. But as any good scientist, you got to have more than one subject. So I waited for Jake to arrive. And I looked at him and I said, "Would you walk with me to the Gaga Ball pit?" Here's Jake's response. "Why? Can I make a cup of coffee?" He looked at me and then said, "Come here, I want to show you something." He then began to talk about some struggle he had had at Walmart. He then organized some shelves in the conference room. He looks at me and says, "I have nothing to do with this." Then he asked, "Is Aaron going?" He then made coffee. We walked outside. We walked for a bit before he took a pause. I looked up and he was laughing. For a few moments, we walked pretty fast. And then when we arrived at the Gaga Ball pit, he recognized that we had arrived. Here's the thing, folks. Isn't that my walk with Jesus? Let me share with you. When God says, "Hey, why don't you take this journey with me?" I think sometimes we just go, "Why? For what?" We might then ask God, "This seems so random." Or "Can I make a cup of coffee first? I've got other plans ahead of you right now." We then begin maybe to pour out our hearts before God to go, "Listen, do you understand what I'm struggling with? I had a tough time at Walmart." We begin to do who knows what. And I think at some point we begin to walk with God, and there are points where our walk, we're really trying to keep up with God. We're going just as fast as we can go, and I think at some points everything in life is perfect, and we're just finding joy and happiness, and we laugh with the Lord. But it's ultimately all about the fact of, can we walk with God faithfully until the point we arrive to heaven and recognize the reward that God has promised? Here's what Paul would say to the church in Galatia. "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, you will be destroyed by each other." He says, "So I say," what? "Walk by the Spirit." Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. I don't know about you, but in my walk with God, there are times where everything is going great and I'm finding joy and peace and grace and mercy and happiness. And there are points where I look up and go, "How did I get here?" I want us to try to be like people like Enoch. That maybe at some point, at the end of my years here on this planet, that it would be said of me, for however long God grants me life and breath, that it would be said, for so many years, Chris walked faithfully with God. That is my hope and my prayer for you, so that one day we might recognize the reward that God's already promised.